Good evening, everybody. I hope you are all okay this evening. Welcome to this Tortoise ThinkIn about clinical depression and whether it can be cured. My name is Liz Moseley. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise. And before we get going this evening, just to say, normally at Tortoise, we ask you to kind of use your real name and switch on your camera and all that kinds of things, but we'd like people to share if they are able to, if they'd like to, either by joining in the chat where my colleague Ellen will be sort of marshalling people's comments and what have you, and if you are keen to make a contribution about personal experience or insights or reflections and comments on the things we're going to hear from our invited experts, then by all means do that. If you'd rather not use your real name, if you want to leave your camera off, that's okay too. But obviously, as with the thinking, it's important that we come together to kind of try and thrash out a point of view. The size of the audience this evening is testament to the fact that this is something that is affecting a lot of people directly and indirectly. And I'm conscious of the sensitivity of what it is we're here to talk about. But we do have quite a specific and precise question that we want to try and answer, something that's come up time and time again in a roundabout way and in a direct way in ThinkIn's throughout this year. And actually my colleague Liv was reminding me last year too, when the world was normal, we did a huge tour of lots of UK universities and had conversations about mental health and mental ill health with lots of students as well. So we have a lot of sort of material and data points to work with. I'm going to try and come at this evening's conversation with two frames. The first frame relates to Oliver Kamm's book, Mending the Mind. Oliver's joined us. He's a writer, well-known writer. Lots of you will have read his stuff in the Times. And the frame of that is really about his own experience of clinical depression and so the question, can it be cured in the context of an individual person or patient? And then I'm kind of going to use some of the insights in the book, which I think are helpful to sort of unpack a broader question. Can depression be cured sort of collectively on a societal level? How do we make progress in tackling a problem that is, as you've seen in the slides just now, so pervasive and it would seem increasingly so? But let's start with Oliver's book, if we can, to sort of set the scene a little bit. And good evening, Oliver. Thank you very much for being here. It's nice to see you. I think essentially in your book, it is a message of hope, which I think is a good place to start for a conversation like this, because you have a very clear and specific thesis that you want to get across in the book from your own experience of this horrible condition. Would you just sort of set out some of the central tenets of that thesis, just so we can get a grip on where you're coming from?
Sure, thank you, Liz. Good evening, everyone. My thesis in my book, Mending the Mind, can be stated very simply. It is that clinical depression is real and it's treatable. That sounds, on the face of it, a fairly mundane argument or conclusion, but I think it's very important for the quality of life in advanced industrial economies like Britain and globally as well. And it's particularly important now when we're in the middle, or perhaps at the beginning of the end, let us hope, of a once-in-a-century global pandemic, a historic crisis of public health, with a pathogen that we now know is a multi-system, or creates a multi-system illness, including direct effects on mental health. Clinical psychologists have observed that something like more than 2 billion people at any one time have been in some form of lockdown globally, and they've called it perhaps the most extensive psychological experiment ever. It cannot but have implications for mental health, and to have exacerbated a condition that we know is common to human society throughout recorded history and probably in prehistory as well. My thesis is that clinical depression is a real illness, like any other, with a complex combination of causes, physiological, social, psychological, and it causes immense harm. The World Health Organization estimates that at any one time, more than 250 million people globally have clinical depression, and that is in pre-pandemic times. The experience of isolation and worry and apprehension for those we love and for ourselves is highly likely to have aggravated that. I would expect, looking at history, at the fact that after the 1918 to 1920 global pandemic of influenza, there was a substantial rise in the incidence of psychiatric disorders, that we're looking at something similar in the wake of our current crisis. And my insistent theme is that it is a real illness and it's treatable. There are treatments that work. I have been through them. There are plenty that don't meet the criteria of scientific inquiry, but there are some that do. And it's vital that public health concentrate on the message that this pathology of clinical depression is treatable. There are remedies that work, not for everyone, but for most people, most of the time, these treatments work better than placebos or just allowing clinical depression to wear itself out, which in the case of many people, it doesn't. It causes immense distress, anxiety, and is a direct threat to life. So that's my thesis. It's real and it's treatable.
Thanks, Oliver. I think that one of the sort of the promise of the book is a hopeful one, but to buy that message, there's a bit of a price to pay. We sort of have to let go of some of our belief systems that we may have acquired or lazily picked up or quite like having about the nature of what it is to be a human being. You're sort of fairly uncompromising in the way that you sort of spell out the reason why this therapy, for example, works and this one doesn't is this. And it comes down to, perhaps, if I can summarize, and correct me if I'm wrong, a sort of unhelpful duality in the way we talk and think about health. We're used to hearing parity of esteem as a way to sort of talk about campaigning for mental health needs to be invested in and thought of, and with the equivalent sort of gratitude that poorly leg or, a physical symptom would be. But you're saying that it's not really, talking about body and mind equally isn't helpful, because mind is body. They are one and the same.
That's right. Parity of esteem, the phrase you rightly invoke, is a legal requirement of healthcare. It has been for some years. My argument is that treating physical illness and mental illness as two distinct conditions is not helpful. The reason that mental disorders are a matter of absolutely central importance for public health policy is not mere politeness, that you want people who are suffering from psychiatric disorders to get better and not feel stigma. It is that the illness that they have is itself physiological in origin. The problem with mental disorders collectively and clinical depression specifically in diagnosis, which is the one that I've experienced, is that we can't observe their causes directly, unlike, say, a physical condition, a broken limb or a physical illness like emphysema or lung cancer. We can't observe directly the causes of mental disorder as we can either with the naked eye or with x-rays for physical diseases or conditions. We know clinical depression and other psychiatric disorders from their symptoms rather than from observable wounds. And because we know clinical depression and other disorders by their symptoms rather than through direct observation, it is very easy to assume that these are not real illnesses at all. There is a sort of stigma that still attaches to mental disorder, and specifically the mood disorder of clinical depression. There's a stigma in society where it's regarded often as not really an illness. You see that in commentary, particularly in the profession of journalism, and in the culture wars. And there's a stigma attaching to those who suffer depression itself. They feel ashamed and somehow guilty, as if this malady of the mind is their own fault. And it's very important that we understand that mental disorder is physiological in origin. It just happens to be a malady of the most complex physical organ we have, namely the brain, and the way that the activities of the brain, the interaction of billions of neurons, nerve cells firing within the brain, the way that they affect our cognitions and our emotions and our memories, and somehow, sometimes give rise to disorder, is something we really still don't understand very well. We know at root what's causing it, but we don't know reliably the mechanism by which disorder is caused, or the treatments, how the treatments work. All we do know, and it's very important, is that some treatments do work most of the time for most people, and they really have good science behind them.
Thank you, Oliver. I think that it's that sort of mysteriousness that is caused by the complexity, the sort of, as you said, there's a social, there's a physiological, there's a psychological component to this thing that ends up happening to some people. And because of all of those factors, it sort of becomes mysterious somehow. But your clear assertion is that it's mysterious now, but it's not unknowable in the end, because scientific research has shown some element. There's been progress. We've got some understanding of how the thing works. I might come to Sarah Hughes, who's the Chief Executive of the Centre for Mental Health. Sarah, and a great friend of Tortoise. Hello, it's lovely to see you again. I wonder if you might be able to Oliver's book, it resists saying this is what causes depression, because the truth is we don't know. We know that there are sort of some things that might exacerbate it, or sort of situations that might correlate with incidents of depression. But what's the centre's perspective on what we know about a cause of clinical depression, if there is such a thing?
I mean, I think there's two parts to this paradigm, really. There's the question about prevention, and then there's the question about cure. And I suppose my point of focus really is that I think we do know what causes depression. And there are direct links between issues like poverty, poor housing, adverse childhood experiences. So you can directly correlate adult depression in adulthood, certainly depression in teenage years, with those experiences. And so I would argue that there's something about our approach that misses the opportunities consistently to prevent depression in a way that actually makes a sustained difference. So before we even get to the concept of cure, I think we really need to deal with this matter of prevention. I think Oliver is absolutely right that depression is absolutely curable, and it's curable through many treatments that we have available. I mean, I think in psychiatry we have the slowest innovation in terms of new medical treatments and new interventions, etc., compared to other parts of the health economy. But I think that there is something for me about really understanding these two parts of the system. At the centre, we really focus on that prevention piece, and we focus on equality and trying to think about how can we push forward those policies and those things that make a difference in the longer term. But I think we also have to recognise that once you get to a place of, depression, or you're in that place, cure can only be possible too if you have the conditions in your life that support the treatment that you're getting. So, for example, you can get the best treatment for depression, and I think we do deliver the best mental health treatment in this country compared to other parts of the world when it's good. But if you're still somebody who's going back to a home that, there's domestic violence, there's unemployment, there are financial pressures, that treatment in of itself, you might as well be pouring water into a leaky bucket. And so I think that for me, there is a systemic argument about this whole piece. And much of what Oliver covers in his book is fundamental to answering some of these questions.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to go to Ellen now, my colleague Ellen, who's pulled together the data that you saw at the beginning of the session, because that talks to some of the context that we're dealing with the lockdown effect and with the efficacy of various different types of treatments. I think it's worth having a look at the data, Ellen, if you wouldn't mind taking us through it before we pick up on these two things, the prevention thing and the cure thing, and what is social and what is medical, would seem to me the sort of crux of what we need to try and unpick this evening. So go for it, Ellen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we've already touched on some interesting points that maybe this data can kind of, give us a bit more background on. So, Oliver mentioned straight off that the pandemic will undoubtedly have had an impact on the rates of depression. And that is what we're seeing play out in this data, which is from the Office for National Statistics. Now, they don't collect data on actual clinical depression, but this is about people who say they're experiencing symptoms of moderate to severe depression from March to June. So, that was still early days now, relatively in the pandemic. But what we've seen is quite a big rise amongst all adults, so up from 9.7% to 19.2%. But within that, it's being experienced differently by different groups. So we chose here to highlight the different age groups. We know the pandemic's been challenging on younger people. So, that's almost 1 in 3 young people now reporting moderate to severe symptoms of depression. But interestingly, and I think this touches on what we were just saying about the financial causes potentially, we saw actually one of the biggest rises is also amongst those who said they were unable to afford an unexpected expense. So that's more than 1 in 3 people who see themselves in that category are now experiencing depression. We also know that women are experiencing it more than men at the moment. So I think there's some interesting things to untangle there.
Can I just ask before we move on this one, because I think this is important, tell me if it's not, which is, if this chart shows the percentage of all adults experiencing or reporting symptoms of depression, that's not exactly the same as a sort of these people are suffering. Were they to be diagnosed or seen by a doctor, they'd be diagnosed with suffering from clinical depression. It's not exactly the same.
It's not exactly the same. No, you're right. And if we go to the next slide, then we can talk about that a bit more, because that's why diagnosis is so important. And the other lockdown effect is that people haven't been able to attend GP. So this chart here, you see the predicted number of people that the NHS expected would be diagnosed with depression by their doctor,
right,
from the beginning of 2019 through the year. And then at the orange mark, that's where lockdown begins. So it fell dramatically, despite the fact people, as seen on the previous slide, are feeling depressed. So people are not, being able to access that care. And we see the line rising again there towards through 2020. So people, would have been seeing a doctor, haven't been seeing a doctor, and we don't yet know what the impact of that will be. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, we're going to talk tonight about how we cure depression. At the moment, the kind of first stop solution for many people is medication. Over the past 10, 12 years, we've seen medication become the prominent option. There are different types. The most common types are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they're things like fluoxetine or Prozac is one of the most commonly known. So we see medication is increasingly part of our lives. There are lots of different types of antidepressants, but that's the main one. Can we go to the next one as well, please? The other big question Oliver touched on is, do antidepressants work? There's a lot of grey area here. It's not a clear answer, but this data is from one of the most comprehensive kind of meta-analysis of antidepressants. We've just selected a few of the drugs here, and you can see fluoxetine on that list. But in total, the study analysed 21 different drugs, and it showed that they were all more effective than the placebo. Since the study came out, some people have said that maybe there were biases in the research, which kind of takes us back a few steps into being uncertain about the efficacy of the drugs. But this is still the most comprehensive study. So maybe that gives us a good basis to work from to say antidepressants, do some good.
Yeah.
And then on to the last slide. Very few people, of course, would say antidepressants and medication is the only option. And there's a lot of evidence to say that, talking therapies can actually go some way to looking at the causes of depression and other problems like anxiety as well, rather than just treating the symptoms. This chart here is a study where they took a cohort of people. Some people got the normal treatment just from the GP, which was basically medication, and others had the addition of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most common types of talking therapy that helps people change how they react to difficult situations. And you can see here that over time, they immediately and in the longer term, they actually started to experience less severe symptoms of depression as they reported it themselves. So that's a score that they were able to give themselves on how depressed they were feeling. So that's another option. But one thing that's also worth mentioning is that this kind of service is available on the NHS, but the waiting lists are extremely long. So accessing this kind of care is very, very difficult. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I do want to talk about talking therapies because it's a big and important section in Oliver's book, because not all talking therapies, they're sort of bucketed together a bit, but not all talking therapies are created equal. They don't work in the same way, they don't have the same sort of philosophy, if I can speak, behind them. And I think I want to read just a really short quote to you, Oliver. Very early on in the book, there's this little snippet which sort of rather stopped me in my tracks, where you write, reliable medical knowledge is limited about clinical depression. And then sometime later, you go on and say, we know that genes control brain development and that neurons firing in the brain produce consciousness, but we don't yet know the mechanisms that produce thought. And then when you go on to talk about why, in your case, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, really worked for you, it felt like you sort of rewired the way your brain worked in terms of your thought pattern. Would you just sort of unpack that a little bit for us? Because I think it's really helpful to understand that CBT is really different from other forms of talking therapies that people might have had.
Sure. On the first point, neuroscience is quite a young field of inquiry. It was only in the last century that scientists discovered that the interaction of neurons within the brain give rise to cognitions, emotions, and memories. And at root, though the mix of causes in mental disorder is complex, we know that at root it must be physiological, because the brain is what creates mental processes. It's all that's there. In terms of treatments, the issues that Ellen took us through, antidepressant medication and talking therapies, from my reading of the literature and my own experience, though of course my experience is just a sample of one, antidepressant medication I found extremely valuable, not as a cure for mental disorder, but as a means of stabilizing my emotions. It was the first and vital step that I took towards recovery. But talking therapies, which are much parodied and which I knew little about and didn't take very seriously, were the more fundamental route to recovery. As you rightly say, there are different forms of talking therapy. Some, in the case of mood disorders like clinical depression, don't have a great deal of empirical evidence behind them. The much parodied form of therapy known in its modern form as psychodynamic therapy, which has its roots in the psychoanalytical approach of Freud and his followers. It can be very useful in the case of some of the very psychologically damaged people who psychiatrists see every day in the NHS, who may never have had a positive relationship in their lives, may have been neglected or even abused as children and found it very difficult to cope with relationships in life since then. But the evidence that psychodynamic therapy works for clinical depression is quite limited. The essence, the premise of this approach is that clinical depression arises because of unresolved problems in relationships that we've had in past life. And to cure yourself of depression, to be cured of depression, requires going back through those memories and finding a key to present disorders in disappointment with an authority figure, like a parent or someone of similar stature. there's very little evidence that this is actually of much benefit to those who suffer from clinical depression. A psychoanalyst called Aaron Beck attempted to put psychoanalysis on an empirical footing by conducting experiments, and found somewhat as a surprise that it really wasn't necessary to trawl through your distant memories. What was much more important was to assess the state of a patient's beliefs now and to test them against the evidence. It's very common with someone suffering from depression to believe that they are that they're evil. That was my own belief about myself. I was consumed with guilt and shame because of the salience of my private interpretations of things that had happened in my life. And to test those beliefs, the strength of the evidence for those beliefs, with a dispassionate outsider, with a clinical psychologist in my case, but one can do cognitive behavioral therapy with anyone, or indeed with a computer program, to be able to test the strength of my convictions and the evidence for them with a dispassionate outsider, and to have those cognitive distortions corrected, which is the essence of CBT, was extremely effective. It was my route to recovery. And though I am, as I say, a sample of one, the randomized controlled trials have been done. There is quite a lot of evidence that this form of therapy, much more time limited, much more economical than an open-ended psychodynamic type of approach. There's a lot of evidence that it can help those with mood disorders. And that, to my mind, is very much the route that, that public healthcare should concentrate on in correcting mental disorder.
Thanks, Oliver. I can see a very lively discussion happening in the chat about the various different forms of talking therapies, and some people have had brilliant success with CBT like you did, and other people really didn't. I wonder if I might go to Caroline. She doesn't have a surname showing in the list, who sort of would like to sort of fly the flag for psychodynamic therapy a little bit. Caroline, what sort of, just sort of, it was absolutely not helpful in Oliver's case, but just tell us a bit. You're a psychotherapist, yeah?
Yes, I am a psychotherapist, but I actually stopped practicing quite a while ago.
Right.
My take on psychotherapy is that we all internalize stories about ourselves, and that the relationships that we have, the ones that go wrong, if we don't learn the right way for them to go right again, we just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over. And there is quite a lot of research on this, and proof that people, for example, who pick partners that are not the best for them will move from one bad partner to another bad partner. And in psychotherapeutic terms, well, in psychodynamic terms, we would say that they haven't actually learned, well, as Oliver was talking about, their own worth and what it is that they need to do to move on. So therefore, we're only going backwards and looking at things in the past. We're not looking at everything. That is psychoanalytic, where you do sort of like every single thing you've ever done. And I think psychodynamic therapy has moved on quite a long way from Freud. Even when I was practicing, we are more looking now at big instance, things that really strike people, that they're carrying, and trying to undo misconceptions. And undoing those misconceptions can release emotions that mean that fundamentally change how people live their lives. Absolute epiphanies. So that's what I would say.
Would you say, Caroline, that we sort of had this, we sort of slightly set up a I don't know, mirror image or something, where we were talking about with Sarah, there's prevention, there's stuff that we need to do to help people to stay well. And that's all manner of things. It talks to questions of poverty. It talks to all manner of sort of social housing, you know, basic stuff to keep your life not being too horrendous. Things that can sort of send you sort of on a path that makes it much harder to feel that things are going to be okay. And then there's a sort of, once you're actually ill, properly ill, and you're suffering with this condition, clinical depression, what we then do to get you better again, well again. Do you have a sort of view on whether your type of talking therapy that you were trained to do lives more in one or the other, or is it both, or do you have a sense of where it would be most effective?
I think, I mean, what we're talking about is it can be that circumstances and experiences weigh you down so that you can no longer cope and you go into a state of clinical depression. Now, if you want to get out of that state, there are lots of ways of helping people, as Oliver has said, and helping them move on. But if those pressures are remaining there, then that's not helpful, obviously, and that's going to keep pushing you in the direction of depression. But it's kind of like, you know, chicken egg. If you're still depressed, you're not functioning in a way that might help you get out of those.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I'm going to come to my good friend Julia Samuel, who's joined us this evening. She's a great friend of Tortoise and helped us all in the very early part of lockdown. Hi Julia, lovely to see you.
It's lovely to see you.
Hello. Just, you're always very wise. Just weigh in. What are we getting right and wrong about this stuff?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with anybody, actually. I think it's very, very complicated. I think it is mind and body. The two are completely interconnected. I think the thing we really want to focus on and put money into is prevention, and earlier prevention, the better. I think adverse childhood experiences have enormous impact on people's mental health in their future. And we know that things that have happened to you in childhood, by the time they're 5, if you don't get an intervention immediately, they will be acted out when you're 14, and then your outcomes are very bad. As for which model of therapy is best, I mean, the research that I value, and I think everyone can go on any side, is it's the quality of the relationship that predicts outcomes in therapy. So there are 3 models, there are 3 schools of therapy. There's CBT, which what I think affects how I feel, and that affects my behavior. Analytic, as Oliver talked about, which is that your past, you know, very much affects your present and brings out neurosis, and you have to kind of understand your past by the analysis with your therapist. And then the type of therapist I am, which is humanistic, which is that it's in the relationship between you and the therapist that they are the experts on themselves, and if you create a good enough relationship, they can then cure themselves. And you know, I use some CBT with people, and I think that the people can be very helped by analysis, and people have very, very deep relationships with analysis. I mean, one of the big things that I'm very excited about is social prescriptions. I don't know if Oliver, I haven't read your book, Oliver. I'm sure it's brilliant, and I very much want to read it. And obviously it's, you know, top of my list. But I'm very excited both for the outcomes of connection. I think loneliness has a huge part to play in both physical and mental illness. And of course, physical illness creates mental illness and vice versa, and not going to work. So they're all very interconnected. And I think, you know, here in Frome, we've had an amazing project, which is called the Compassion Project, where they set up networks of clubs of different people with different illnesses, knitting clubs, talking clubs, men's sheds, where in 2017, the NHS emergency admissions rose by 25, and within our area, they dropped by 20. And that was a sort of version of early intervention, where older people who'd been widowed, maybe had a condition, were then connected with health connectors. And they had lots of meetups, basically. And that has had a massive impact on people's well-being. And it's all through kind of coming together. I think loneliness has a huge part to play. And I think, you know, my kind of shout is that love is strong medicine. You know, that however you build relationships with people, that has a massive impact on your mental health.
Thanks so much, Julia. It's lovely to see you, and thank you for sparing the time this evening. Now, I'm going to try and come back. I'll say the question, then we'll decide where we're going to go with it. So, I look at those. I look at the stats. I hear the news. I see the graphs, and I think it sort of feels logically understandable to me that, particularly this year, when people have been on their own, people are more likely to be bereaved, people are struggling financially, it feels really normal and understandable and obvious to me that there would be an increased incidence of people you know, experiencing symptoms of depression. That seems really straightforward, not hard to get my head around. so people are, if you're more liable to experience depression if your life is worse, and lots of people's lives are worse, it sort of leads us to sort of this problematic tension that I think is what's playing out a little bit in the chat, which is, and I think that's, it also sort of, it's why we hear people say things like, well, if your life is worse, you know, don't go to the doctor and say that you've got depression. You know, that's where that sort of slightly unempathetic view comes from. And I suppose what I'm trying to get to is, I can hear and I can see a narrative that would suggest that we are over-diagnosing, and by extension potentially over-prescribing antidepressant medication, as well as a narrative that would suggest, and maybe this is a question for Sarah, that we are in fact under-diagnosing and leaving people who are really struggling without talking to them properly. And I'm trying to get a sense of which of those things is the right way to look at. You know, it could even be the same data set that we would see that would lead two different people on two different days to those two different conclusions. I can't get a grasp on which it is.
So I think the point is that they're not binary, and it's part of the same question. And I think that we're asked this question a lot about, so we recently published a forecast. We forecast mental health demand alongside the NHS and recently the government, and we forecast that about 10.5 million people are going to need extra mental health support over the next 12 months as a direct result of the pandemic.
10.5 million people.
Yes. And as the pandemic deepens, that number will grow. And I hate to be kind of bleak about it, because I also think it's optimistic. So we are not pathologizing the nation. And I think, let's be very clear that what we're saying is that we're at a point in which before the pandemic, mental health services were not robust. All of the people that were needing mental health services weren't getting them. We are now in the middle of a global pandemic. We have got an increased number of people who need services and who need treatment. So these are people who meet treatment threshold.
Yeah.
And so I think that, what we're talking about is making sure we get that prevention right, so that we can mitigate the harm that the pandemic is doing. We know what some of these causes are. And Julia is so right. I'm so pleased that she mentioned social prescribing, because that is an important initiative that is being supported by government and organisations around the country. So we know what can mitigate, but we also need to get our services up and ready for what is about to happen. And we do have concerns about workforce, about coverage, about appropriate treatments to cover things like complex grief for the 10,000 plus children who've lost their parents. So I think what we're talking about here is a number of factors. We're also talking about trauma-informed environments, so that people can go back into workplaces, to schools, to communities, and be understood and supported in a way that can also mitigate great harm. So I think that, the answer to your question, Liz, is that there is no clean answer, and that we perhaps shouldn't hold a binary approach to these two things, because actually they're always moving, and mental health isn't a fixed kind of paradigm. It's a spectrum. Mental health is a spectrum. Mental illness is one part of that spectrum, and we're moving up and down it every day. So I think it's important to hold that in mind, but also to I think remember that the deepening pandemic is causing both individual issues in terms of how you are coping, but it's also causing issues in communities and society as a whole. And these are the things that I think we need to face going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Just to be clear, when I look over here, it's not because I'm bored or I'm not listening to what you're saying. It's that I've got the chat on my other big screen over there, because it's too small otherwise. So don't think I'm being rude and ignoring you when you're talking. Thanks so much, Sarah. I might come to my colleague. Is Paul here? Paul Caruana-Galizia. Are you on the call, Paul? I wonder if you are. Paul, calling Paul. Are you here, Paul? If not, I'll go to Tom Goulding. Because you worked with Paul together on a very early piece of work for Tortoise that is not about antidepressant prescriptions, but it is about people experiencing and reporting sort of chronic, Well, is it mental health conditions, is it physical health conditions? Seeing some of those correlations, it was a story about the interplay of medicine and social trauma. Would you just sort of tell us a bit about the context of that and what you think we can or can't extrapolate from what you observed in the Northeast with what we're talking about now?
Sure, yeah. So we found that people who had early adverse childhood experiences, such as abuse or domestic violence, were much more likely to become addicted to opioids. And we know the same, addicted to opioids, and we know the same about depression as well. If you have those experiences, you're much more likely to become depressed or be diagnosed with depression. And a growing tool to fight opioid addiction is social prescribing, and there's a growing body of evidence that it's going to be a lot more helpful with depression as well, because, you know, as people have mentioned in the chat, antidepressants can be really useful for some people, but with quite like a fixed ceiling of what they can do. And social prescribing, I think, speak to our, you know, needs, which we kind of don't really understand very well, our psychological needs. I think we understand our physical needs quite well, but, you know, those needs to feel like we have meaning and purpose in life, to feel like, you know, we have a future that makes sense, to feel like, you know, we belong, to feel seen and heard in life. And I think a lot of our built and lived environment, society, is not structured to meet those needs. If you don't understand the needs, it's going to be difficult to have structured society. Literally how we build cities, how we work, how we live, what we live near, our sense of community is going to struggle to meet those needs.
So, Tom, when you observed that correlation in the Northeast, particularly between people who had experienced really awful, we called it social trauma, I think was the language that we used in the book, and there's very high incidence of, in this instance, painkillers prescribing. It wasn't antidepressant medication you were looking at, it was painkillers. What was the sort of sense of a conclusion that people were going to the doctor with pain, but the pain was registering physically for something that was, you know, we talked about that mind-body thing. Is that where we went with that?
Yeah, and often the pain can be quite abstract, which is not to mean it's no less real or no less severe. People's pain, which might be depression, it might be chronic pain. There's a lot of overlap between the two. These are kind of umbrella terms, I think, that we use. That pain might have, there's maybe a susceptibility from early adverse child experiences, just like there's a genetic susceptibility to depression, which doesn't mean that those people will necessarily have chronic pain or necessarily become depressed, but it makes you much more likely that if you interact with things in your life, social things, personal things in your life that are would cause chronic pain or depression, they are much more likely to do so. And yeah, I mean, with the pain example, it might come from particular points in the body, such as, you know, you had a hernia operation or you had a broken elbow, but it would develop into chronic pain that is kind of totalizing and originated there, but is kind of full body, and you know, it will kind of exhibit as social distress. That's obviously not how it would be like verbalized a lot of the time, but that's it's kind of this thing which I think we generally understand quite poorly as being, you know, total in the body of, you know, a mind and body experience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. I think that's interesting. I haven't fully unpacked what that means for this, but it feels like there's something in there. And I remember we had a ThinkIn about, I think the theme of ThinkIn was medical sexism, actually, and there was a GP who runs a practice down the road in Hackney from where I am now, who talked about how every single person who walked into his clinic with his surgery with chronic pain, his claim was every single one of them had experienced severe trauma in their life, you know, emotional in their life, which to me was sort of mind-blowing. It would feel to me like it's sort of there's some work we have to do on pain, physical, emotional. I know they're all the one, but it would seem to me there's something in there. I'm going to come back to Oliver, because there's something I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable about, Oliver, that you talk about a lot in the book, which is to do with legitimacy. and you talked about when you were really ill, your sort of thought patterns related to you sort of contrast this sort of language that people use, which is get a grip, there's nothing wrong, there's, you know, what have you got to complain about? And you can sort of, you can almost dispassionately observe your life and go, well, I have a job and my children are healthy. You can almost see it, but you can't feel it. And my slight discomfort with talking about patterns of social trauma and social deprivation and the correlations with depression is that somehow those people who experience depression in that way, you know, that's legitimate depression. And then there are other people who experience depression and they just need to kind of get over it. Is that relevant at all?
It's very relevant. You make a very acute point. It goes back to your earlier question of, are we over-diagnosing depression or under-diagnosing it? And I would say very firmly that we're under-diagnosing it. As a society, I don't mean what professional psychiatrists and other medical staff do, but as a society, we're not taking clinical depression seriously enough. And you find it again and again in newspaper commentary, which is my own profession. You find this this premise, which I confess I held myself for a long time, which is that there are some people who undergo immense hardship. And for example, some of my close friends have survived the genocide of their communities and have managed to build successful and admirable lives. And there are those like me who've lived all our lives in constitutional societies, are extremely fortunate in family and professional life and standard of living. And there's a premise on the part of some commentators that only the first group, people who undergo tremendous hardship, maybe are shot at in war zones, know what depression is like, and that we are pathologizing the natural sadnesses and vicissitudes of life in applying it more widely. And this, I think, is a serious mistake. Depression is not like the conventional sadnesses that we all suffer from time to time. Sarah very rightly said that mental disorder is on a continuum. I do want to stress, however, that whereas we all feel sadnesses, disappointments, rejections at various times in our life, because we all suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, thwarted ambitions, disappointments in love, bereavements, and so on. Depression is not low mood consequent upon these misfortunes. It is a clinical illness in which feelings of despair and shame and guilt are overwhelming. There is no leaven to it. And there are many mysteries, as we've discussed, about the cause of depression, what mix there is of psychological factors, some genetic, as Tom referred to, underlying everything physiological. There are many mysteries about it. And the message that I wanted to get over, that I do want to get over in my book, and as you kindly invited me to talk in this event, it is that there are things that benefit us, social connections, physical recreation, exercise, the open air, but there are also scientific approaches, science-based approaches to do with medication and talking therapies that do have a stigma attached to them, and yet the evidence is that they are beneficial, that they really do good for people who suffer. I don't want to make light of whatever works for anyone who is in this position, but I do recount the state of the randomized controlled trials, which Ellen referred to, both in the case of talking therapies and of antidepressant medication, and to relate how they help me in my own life, my own condition. And I think that public health policy really needs to stress these as we hopefully emerge from the global pandemic before too long.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Philip Luff if I can. There's Philip, if you're there, you mentioning, I can see in the chat, this trial at Imperial that just sounds interesting. Would you just mind sort of, I don't notice it sort of piqued Julia's interest, to just, what's the trial to do with? Is it a new drug or?
Hi, Liz. Yeah, I'm not an expert, but I'm a television producer, so I've been doing some research in this area. Again, sort of based on what's been studies being done in America, but as I understand, it's more about severe anxiety, depression, in the sense of, resulting from trauma, addictions, even to the extent of, sort of physical addictions to lots of different substances, or to mental ideas about eating disorder, for example. So I've been reading a little bit about it, and there are trials being done at the moment, really looking at the science, and maybe someone else on here can talk about the science a bit more, but what physically happens to the serotonin 2A receptors in the brain, which, are very much connected to the gut. And I'm fascinated by that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole gut microbiome thing, I think, is completely fascinating. So we will watch that with interest. There's so many people weighing in on the chat. I'd like to bring a couple more people in from the room before we close, but I'd like to go to Sarah. When we opened, actually it might have been before we let everybody in, actually, we said that yourself and Oliver are essentially optimists about this, which is good news for us all. Oliver, because of his thesis that he laid out, but your interests are very much more about, there are, you talk of millions of people, and you talk of people really struggling, and you say words like poverty. These are not easy problems to solve. So could you just, and we've talked about how difficult the provision isn't there, and the waiting list along, and those kinds of things. Why? What cause for optimism is there in thinking, how can we, if not rid the world of depression, then certainly learn to manage it a lot better and minimize it?
Well, I don't think it's going to be easy. And I think my optimism is stretching over the next decade. So I'm not saying that in the next 6 weeks, we're all good to go. I think there's something for me about thinking about what happened in the last pandemic, although, none of us were around, but we do know that we had the roaring 20s of creativity, of massive transformation and change. And I think after this collective trauma that we globally have experienced, we will inevitably have that again. We have also seen things during this pandemic that we now can't unsee. And we are having conversations with government in a way that we've never had before. So whilst I absolutely am standing on the head of government all the time with my size 8s, believe me, I'm also hearing things that I haven't heard before. And so to hold their feet to the fire, we have to get them to really accept the truth of the despair that everybody's experiencing. So the irony of me being optimistic is about, actually, we've seen the truth of this situation. We've seen the truth of the way people are living. And I, for one, and many of my colleagues across the mental health sector are not going to let it go effectively. So I do feel optimistic.
If there was a question that we at Tortoise could look into, a sort of journalistic question, a myth that is stubbornly persistent that needs to be debunked, or a story, a positive story that isn't well told, what are the sorts of places we might go looking for that story, particularly in relation to clinical depression?
I think there are stories about peer support and things that are happening in local communities that are really changing people's lives. And it comes back to that conversation about social prescribing. Peer support has been the phenomenal kind of show of the year, really, in that it is stepped up when people have really needed it, and has covered bases that health services could never cover. And so I think that that's a story, that's a positive story that hasn't been told well enough. How people are really helping each other. Digital solutions, which have just popped up, overnight. I've spent a decade trying to persuade NHS services to, embark on digital, and we managed overnight to resolve some of the problems that we'd been trying to resolve for a decade. So I think that it's about taking up those opportunities, now while they're right there, while the need is there, and we are really fighting to make sure the services are going to be there too.
Thanks, Sarah. Oliver, because we sort of did this evening sort of in honour of the release of your book, which is called Mending the Mind. And I have to say, it's completely fascinating. It's really thought-provoking. There were sentences that I really tripped up over as I was going through it, kind of going, really, my God. So I heartily recommend it. Oliver, now that you are well and free of depression, I just wonder, we started it's a sheets question really, can depression be cured? In your case, do you really feel that you are cured forever and it will never come back?
We don't know enough about the illness to say that even a gold standard type treatment can definitively and permanently suppress any risk of a reoccurrence of depression. But what I would say is that the techniques of talking therapy, of time-limited, clinically validated talking therapy, retrained the way I think in such a way that if I do feel depressive tendencies coming on later in life, I will know what to do and I will know how to protect myself. And whether you call that a cure or not, it is an effective remedy, and I'm confident I will know what to do. And having had the benefit of, I was extremely fortunate in having the benefit of these treatments and also having the unreserved support of my employer, which many people who suffer depression do not have. Having had that benefit, I wanted to tell other people that there are effective treatments out there. And if, going back to Sarah's point, if we do find that after this pandemic, there is a greater receptivity and sympathy for the incidence of mental health, then that is an unalloyed good coming out of this terrible crisis.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased that you are well. We've covered a lot of ground this evening. I want to say a big thank you, of course, to Oliver and to Sarah for giving us their evening and their insights in this very important, and everybody who's kind of contributed on screen. Just to the sort of, we've talked about lots of different types of therapies. Actually, a big theme, an important one in Oliver's book, is about researching, understanding, checking the data, making sure that you're confident. So for heaven's sake, don't go out and buy yourself some psychotic drugs and treat your own depression in the way that wasn't what Luke was saying. But obviously, if you are feeling unwell or you're struggling or somebody near you is struggling, then please go and find the professional help that you need. There's a lot of work that tortoise are doing in this space, which Ellen gathered together and shared a link, kind of ThinkIn discussions like this one, journalistic reporting. So I really do wish you all a sort of healthy rest of the week, rest of the evening. Thank you for being here. Look after yourselves and each other, and we will return to this time and again, because it's something that matters to all of us. So thank you for being here this evening. Go and have nice dinner and relax. See you later. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Sarah.
Take care.
Thanks.